Thank you all for coming out this chilly evening. My name is Jared Ortiz, and I teach theology in the religion department and am the director of the Saint Benedict Institute. We're very pleased to be hosting Michael Hanby tonight. This talk is supported by a grant from the Lumen Christi Institute with funding from the John Templeton Foundation. And we'd also like to thank all of our Hope College co-sponsors, the philosophy department, the religion department, the Dean for Arts and Humanities, and the Dean for Natural and Applied Sciences. Dr. Hanby is an associate professor of religion and philosophy of science at the John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C., and most recently the author of the book, No God, No Science, Theology, Cosmology, Biology, which reassesses the relationship between the doctrine of creation, Darwinian evolutionary biology, and science. I know Michael Hanby and his work from two very serious engagements back in the day. First, Dr. Hanby is a leader in the classical education movement. Back in 2010, he and I were fellow parishioners at a small working-class parish in Maryland and were tasked with crafting a curriculum for the struggling local Catholic school. The result was a 120-page manifesto on classical education, which saved the local school and became a model for schools around the country. Though we had a wonderful team and everyone contributed, Michael was really the visionary behind that document. And he and I spent many a late night drinking IPAs together to finish it on time. Second, Dr. Hanby's first book, Augustine and Modernity, contains one of the clearest accounts of Augustine's theology of creation, and I engaged this book deeply while writing my own dissertation on Augustine and creation, and benefited enormously. Dr. Hanby, as one friend recently put it, is one of the most trenchant critics of our technopoly, and one of the most brilliant thinkers alive today. Tonight, we are privileged to hear him speak on technology and truth. Please help me welcome Dr. Michael Hanby.
Thank you, Jared. That was a bit over the top, but I appreciate it. I don't get to hear those kinds of things very often. No, it's wonderful to be here. I've never been to Hope, never been to Holland, never been to Western Michigan. Haven't seen Jared in years, and I'm immensely enjoying all three. What a wonderful place, and what a great and wonderful person to have leading this institute, which is doing really amazing things here. I'm learning. So it's I will go home inspired and impressed that all of you, and I want to also reiterate Jared's thanks that you've come out. This is my first taste of winter. A nice bracing taste. I debated with myself even on whether to bring a coat, and I'm glad I won. So anyway, thank you all for being here. In one way or another, everyone seems to be concerned about technology these days, even as we are also enthralled with its limitless possibilities. The relentless stream of technological progress continually gives us things we didn't even know we wanted. Its possibilities seem so magical that it's often difficult even to imagine them until after they are an accomplished fact. That's part of what's so unsettling about it. It can be hard to put our finger on just what the concern is, but there is a pervasive sense, to borrow a phrase from Anton Barbakai's great book, A Web of Our Own Making, that somehow we were changed while we were not looking. There is a worry, especially with the rapid development of AI, that technological power exceeding our powers of imagination and anticipation also exceeds our control. That it is no longer our servant and has become our master, or will very soon. The Catholic Church anticipated this over a half century ago at the Second Vatican Council, though it obviously did not anticipate the precise shape of a future beyond imagining, when it declared that, quote, the human race is involved in a new stage of history, triggered by the intelligence and creative energies of man, end quote. Actually, that's not the end of the quote. It's a typo. These energies recoil upon him, upon his decisions and desires, both individual and collective, upon his manner of thinking and acting, which have transformed both the theoretical and practical orders, end quote. How should we understand this recoil? We often think of technology according to what I sometimes call the Boromir paradigm. Those of you familiar with The Lord of the Rings will know what I'm talking about. We imagine technology as merely a tool or an instrument, something essentially outside of us that leaves its users unaffected. Technology in this understanding is a powerful tool, but this power is subordinate to us and neutral in itself. It's how we use it that matters. The important thing, as Boromir argued at the Council of Elrond, is that this great power be used by good people for good purposes and moral purposes instead of evil ones. And of course, we imagine that we are the good people with the good purposes. Like Boromir, we think we can handle it. Though it didn't turn out so well for Boromir, there was an obvious truth in his position. Plato and Aristotle both tell us, and we are discovering this anew in our own day, that the art of medicine can be used for healing or for killing. We have to make decisions every day about whether to use technology for good or for ill. But the safety of the Boromir paradigm, which I think makes it comforting and therefore entices us to adapt it, is illusory. It does not really apprehend the nature of modern technology in contrast to older forms of human making, and therefore does not capture the full breadth and depth of what technology is for us. None of us would have the faintest idea how to live without electricity, or cars, or airplanes, or all that they make possible. Climate-controlled rooms, refrigeration or heat, as the case may be, strawberries in winter, evening lectures in Holland, Michigan. We got a glimpse of the harrowing alternative to this during the pandemic, when we discovered just how fragile the supply chain is, how an interruption in the production of microchips on the other side of the world could cause random items to go missing from the shelves of stores for weeks at a time. Immersion in technology profoundly alters our sense of what is normal. We simply take it for granted that thousands of babies are conceived in laboratories each year, and thousands of undead embryos are frozen away in a kind of limbo. We hardly blink at science fiction fantasies that have become reality. The distinction between sex and gender is treated simply as a biomedical fact, not a historically novel idea with a dubious ideological history. And so it seems normal to have developed drugs and surgeries that we think will transform boys into girls and vice versa. Perhaps your children won't blink at this. Modern travel and digital communications have obliterated the barriers of time and space. I can call down more information than any human being could possibly digest within a lifetime from some kind of virtual cloud by simply wiggling my thumb. Soon, there will be no one living on earth who remembers a time before smartphones, who is not conditioned to apprehend the world, to interact with others, to find their way around, to buy and sell, or even to do their most basic thinking and remembering through a screen. Technology is not simply a neutral instrument lying outside us, subject to our decisions. It is the all-embracing milieu in which we live and move and have our being. An artificial God of sorts, nearer to me than I am to myself, with artificial approximations of the divine attributes of omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and ubiquity. Almighty Google, unto whom all hearts are open, all desires known, and from whom no secrets are hid. Like the true God, it is impossible to encapsulate all that the artificial God of technology is in just one description. Technology is a second nature to us, which mediates and obscures our first given nature. The technological conquest of nature, according to the philosopher Hans Jonas, has become the forward thrust of the race, the collective raison d'etre of modern political and social order, which resembles Francis Bacon's New Atlantis much more than Hobbes' Leviathan or Locke's Second Treatise or the Federalist Papers or even our own Constitution. Technology does not wait on politics, which increasingly seem to belong to the analog world anyway. Technology has become what Napoleon said politics was, destiny, which is perhaps why we worry that it imperils our freedom. To say that technology is destiny, George Grant describes it still more ominously as a fate, is to say that technology is a regime of necessity that carries us along by its own momentum and compels us to respond to its exigencies. 20 years ago, no one even knew or imagined that they needed or wanted a smartphone. I didn't. And while you're still free to choose not to use one, though it's getting harder by the day to make that choice, you're not free from having to choose. And one way or the other, your choice comes at a cost. So technology does not leave its users unaffected. Rather, our immersion in the milieu of technology shapes how we think and what we think there is to think about. Aristotle hit on an essential truth when he said that the soul is in a certain way all things, and ours are being conformed to this milieu. Perhaps this is why Pope Francis called the, quote, technocratic paradigm, the reign of technology, an epistemological paradigm, an understanding inscribed into the word technology itself, a fusion of techne and logos, making and knowing. Technology is a form of knowledge. It is the lens through which we apprehend the world. George Grant, whom I mentioned earlier, called technology the ontology of modernity, not just a philosophy of knowledge, but a philosophy of being and nature. And both of these descriptions of technology underscore a point of fundamental importance for understanding technology more deeply and for understanding the threat it poses to the human future as human. We like to imagine science and technology as objective, as the thing whose objectivity we can count on, in contrast to the humanities, for example. Science derives much of its great authority in modern society from this presupposition. But the idea of a pure science, uncontaminated by philosophy, is an illusion, both historically and in principle. Technology and the science responsible for it presuppose, embody, and perpetuate philosophical judgments about the most fundamental realities, irrespective of whether they're believed in or not. Judgments about God, being, nature, knowledge, and truth, long before science generates the endless stream of artifacts and devices that we normally mean by technology. In saying technology embodies a philosophy, I don't mean that we make conscious philosophical inferences from it, or that it comes with a full-blown, that its use comes with a full-blown theory about the world. I mean something rather like C.S. Lewis meant in The Abolition of Man, which I understand some of you may have come into the room having just read a few moments ago or talked about, which is certainly one of the most important little books of the 20th century, and truer now than at the time when Lewis wrote it. I mean something like what Lewis meant when he described the effects of an English grammar book that he called the Green Book on its students. Lewis writes, quote, "It is not a theory they put into his mind, but an assumption, which 10 years hence, its origin forgotten and its presence unconscious, will condition him to take one side in a controversy which he has never recognized as a controversy at all." Technology conditions us. as the milieu in which we live and move and have our being. Technology is a lens that we do not see but see through, that colors our apprehension of the world in advance. It determines what it now means for us to think, but just as importantly, perhaps more importantly, it determines what we cannot see, what it is no longer possible or meaningful for us to think about. To the degree that modern science is essentially and perpetually revolutionary, the scientific revolution has not ended. Nevertheless, in order to grasp the essence of this hidden philosophy, we must go back to the origins of modern science in the 17th century. And to understand what was revolutionary about it, we have to understand what figures like Galileo, Descartes, Bacon, and Newton were reacting against, namely, the tradition of Christian Platonism in its scholastic Aristotelian form. It was an axiom for this tradition that art imitates nature. Positively, this meant that art could be understood as an analogy for nature, as when Aquinas says, quote, "Nature is nothing other than a certain kind of art, namely God's art, impressed upon things, whereby those things are moved to a determinate end. It is as if a shipbuilder were able to give to timbers the wherewithal to move themselves to take the form of a ship," end quote. In this positive sense of the axiom, it points us towards the facts that artifacts are kind of an image of their maker, possessing being on loan, so to speak, and bearing the imprint in that being of the artisan's mind and intentions. A painting reveals the hidden beauty or meaning that an artist sees in nature or in a historical phenomenon. A hammer expresses our need for something to pound nails with. And we can even think of numerous ways that art exceeds nature, or artifacts can imitate and exceed nature in their organization and indirectedness, in their magnification of human power, in their permanence, in their beauty. The European landscape, or even a simple garden, reveal that human artifice in its best and most proper sense stands in a relation to nature roughly analogous to grace, elevating, perfecting, and partly completing nature, Aristotle says. It's significant that God placed Adam in a garden and not in a wilderness. But negatively speaking, to say that art imitates nature is to say that a natural thing has something that an artifact does not, or rather, that a natural thing is something that an artifact is not. A natural thing, which for Aristotle means principally a living thing, is characterized by entelecheia, by having, or rather being, its own end and project. It feeds itself, moves itself, grows and develops from the inside out, heals itself, and faces the world that is other than itself in a posture of need that becomes appetite and higher forms of desire as you ascend the ladder of life from plants to lower and higher animals to the human being. A living thing has a stake in being, a sake. And this sake is the reason that it develops and grows and acts in characteristic ways, which means that its unity, what it is, precedes its actual historical development as the source and goal of its unfolding. Without this sake, which is another way of saying without some conception of its good, its parts would be unintelligible. Which is why teleology, final causality, the good, whichever you prefer to call it, is implicit in the identification of any being whatsoever. The notion of a watch implies the notion of a good watch. What a watch is and does when it's in good working order. And it's because we know this that we can tell it apart from a broken watch or a hunk of scrap metal, or a healthy human being from a diseased one. What is first in being is last in development, a truth mirrored in the order of intentionality. Just as my intention to come to Holland and speak to you precedes my arrival, so a human embryo grows and develops into a mature adult because it is already human. Its nature precedes its development, just as my intention precedes my action. And all of this is what, or at least part of what, Aristotle meant by substantial form as a principle of unity and identity. What he meant by nature as an internal principle of motion, and what he meant by soul in a living thing. It marks an interior horizon, a relation to one's own being that makes it meaningful to ask, in the words of Thomas Nagel's famous essay, what it's like to be a bat. Because it is like something to be a bat. But it makes no sense to ask what it is like to be an iPhone or what it's like to be ChatGPT, because it's not like anything. It makes no more sense what it's like to be an iPhone than to ask ChatGPT to do your praying for you. It probably would. Something to bear in mind when you ask it to do your thinking for you. What do you mean by thinking? An artifact, in contrast to all of this, is not an end in itself. Its being what it is, its end, its meaning, is imposed upon it from the outside. And it bears only an accidental relationship to the stuff from which it's made, in the same way that a tree could be made alternatively into a desk or a baseball bat or into paper. An artifact's project is not its own, but its maker's project. Hence, Aristotle and Aquinas will both say that we are the end of artificial things. And its unity does not precede its growth and development in time as the source and end of that development, but comes about as the end result of its piece-by-piece assembly. And that changes the meaning of unity itself. The unity of living beings in that view is no longer the unity of an existentially indivisible whole transcending its parts. Undivided being, ens indivisum, as Thomas says, but the unity of an aggregate, which will eventually be resolved under Darwinism into the coordinated interaction of its parts and the history of causes that produced it. The unity of an artifact is the unity of a sum, an assemblage of parts outside of parts that are the parts of no real whole. This is the upshot of all of that abstract stuff that I just said. The distinction between nature and artifice is a distinction between two different ways of being a thing. Well, in rebelling against Platonic and Aristotelian form, the architects of early modern science emptied natural things of this indivisible unity, their inherent intelligibility, and the interior horizon that had previously distinguished them from artifacts, qualities that would henceforth become invisible to the eyes of science. Art would no longer imitate nature. Nature would become artifice, a collection of machines, contrived in the 18th century by the hand of a designing God imposing the laws of nature on material parts, and in the 19th century by history or natural selection in an interminable process of trial and error. For 4 centuries now, this machine picture has functioned like a mirror for our self-understanding. Hans Jonas observes a seemingly irresistible tendency in the human mind to understand machines in the image of the human functions they replace, and then to understand the replaced human functions in the image of the machines that replace them. In the 18th century, It was the clock that provided the image in which we understood ourselves. Today it is digital technology and AI, a form of intelligence without consciousness or thinking or understanding or life that increasingly tells us who and what we are. Earlier, I noted George Grant's observation that technology is the ontology of modernity. It presupposes and perpetuates a philosophy of being in nature that I've tried to summarize just now. But I also mentioned Pope Francis's remark that technology, or what he calls the technocratic paradigm, is an epistemological paradigm, a philosophy of knowledge. If the world is really a machine, then knowledge is really engineering. Notice that fusion of techne and logos, making and knowing once again. But if knowledge is really engineering, then truth is really good engineering. Truth, in other words, is our success in taking nature apart, putting it back together, and compelling it to behave according to our own designs. This is the meaning of that famous Baconian axiom that all of you will have heard, even if you haven't read Francis Bacon, that knowledge is power. And his lesser-known identification of truth and utility that is related to it. The axiom doesn't just express a means-end relationship, knowledge for the sake of power, though of course it includes that. We don't simply analyze nature scientifically by experimentally isolating cause-effect relationships for the sake of controlling nature. We understand nature by means of controlling it. And the truth of our knowledge is equivalent to and measured by our power and in controlling and manipulating nature, which of course includes our own nature. This technological understanding of nature, knowledge, and truth fundamentally inverts the traditional ancient world picture, where the given reality of the actual world grounds, limits, and measures what is possible. Reality, in other words, no longer measures our power, but our power is the measure of reality. What we think things are is inevitably determined by what we can do, from which it follows that if you alter what a thing, say a human being, does, you've changed what it is, or so we think. Being, reality itself, comes to be measured by our power rather than the other way around. What is real, what is actual, measured by what is possible. I'll give you one particularly pertinent example, though. Once you recognize the pattern, this form of thinking, you see it absolutely everywhere. Because, for example, we can analyze the undivided act of human procreation, the undivided human act of procreation, into a series of discrete, fungible steps and reallocate it amongst two or more adults. We now think conception is essentially what takes place under a microscope. And sometimes it also happens to take place inside a woman's body. The difference between, say, being a man and a woman or a mother and a father is not principally a difference of function. It's a difference in kind, in what things are. But now we can manufacture children for whom the once natural question, who is my mother, has no answer. And so we no longer regard man and woman, mother and father, as given realities or natural phenomena, integral to human identity and social welfare, but as mere accidents of biology overlaid with social conventions that can be replaced by functionally equivalent roles without loss. Francis Bacon said of the science that he was helping to birth, quote, "The task and purpose of human power is to generate and superinduce on a given body a new nature or natures, to effect the transformation of concrete bodies from one thing into another within the bounds of the possible. But of course, the ultimate limits of possibility can only be discovered by perpetually transgressing the present limits of possibility, by making the heretofore impossible actual. Thus, the technological conflation of nature and art, knowledge and power, truth and utility, initiates a permanent revolution against every form of given order, including, once again, our own nature. And so we lay hold of and redefine the building blocks of reality itself with scarcely a serious thought as to what we're doing. The transformation of the archetypal human realities, man, woman, mother, father, illustrate the point. And this should be a cautionary tale to those clamoring to let science rule us. In a society that reduces all reason to scientific reason, the claim to scientific authority is a powerful tool in concealing exercises of irreducibly political power. But science is not a brake upon our descent into unreality, but is rather its engine. Now, someone will no doubt say to me, because someone always does, yeah, but science works. Now, I would point out in reply that whenever someone invokes the success of technological science to justify its truth, you know that you're still operating within the technocratic paradigm and the Baconian conflations of knowledge and power. In fact, you're simply reasserting the principle. And I would point out further that you can only evaluate the meaning of success from a position beyond technique. And that whatever the immediate achievements of technology, there are legitimate questions about the success of a form of knowledge whose ultimate result cannot be controlled, and that ultimately puts you at war with reality. But let's set all that aside and concede the obvious. The technological conception of reality has been astonishingly successful in the goals it has set for itself, in realizing the Baconian dream to make ourselves the lords and masters of nature. And we all love it. The problem, as Jonas says, is that if nothing succeeds like success, nothing also entraps like success. Control, he explains, by making ever more things available for more kind of uses, enmeshes the user's life in ever more dependencies on external objects. There is no other way of exercising the power than by making oneself available to the uses of things as they become available. Thus, the tasks for theory are set by the practical results of its preceding use, their solutions to be turned again to use, and so on. Add in the irreversibility of technological deeds. We can't unmake the smartphone or the internet. And their cumulative effects, the way they pile on top of each other. And, quote, the situation for later subjects and their choice of action will be ever more the fated product of what was done before, end quote. C.S. Lewis makes a similar point in The Abolition of Man when he explains what man's power over nature must always and essentially be, and why this libido dominandi terminates not in freedom but in slavery. Lewis writes, quote, if one age really attains, by eugenics and scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power. They are weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them, end quote. Now, I've been reading and teaching this text for years, every year, and I always notice something in it with each passing year that I didn't notice on previous readings. And I've noticed of late that when we read it, my students, and I'll include myself in this, inevitably place ourselves in the position of Lewis's protagonists, imagining ourselves as the ones who impose their will on future generations through technology. The pervasive sense of unease with which I began this lecture, the sense that we control technology less than we are controlled by it, the dawning awareness that nobody asked our permission before introducing these world-changing interventions into the stream of history and imposing this regime of technological necessity upon us, suggests that perhaps Lewis's future is our present, that it is not just our children or our children's children whose freedom is in peril, but our own. That this change came over us while we were not looking points to another facet of the conflation of knowledge and power, and one that is ultimately inimical to freedom. If nothing entraps like success, nothing also blinds like success. If by manipulating variable X in an experiment, I can achieve result Y, and if result Y enables me to move on to experiment Z and on and on and on, then the deed justifies itself. And it's superfluous to ask what truth or knowledge or a cause is, or even what X, Y, and Z are. And in fact, there is no way from within this form of reason, increasingly our only form of reason, even to pose the unavoidable question of what things are, or what they might mean, nor any reason to think that they might mean much of anything. What it means for us to think is now all but exhausted by questions of a purely functional kind. How many? How far? From what source? To what effect? This is why, and I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but it's another one of those things that once you do, you can't unsee it. This is why there is no such thing as a profound question in American public life. Because as Americans, we confront reality not as a mystery to be penetrated or meaning to be plumbed, but as a problem to be solved by scientific, managerial, political, or therapeutic technique. St. Thomas once said, quote, "The name intellect arises from the intellect's ability to know the most profound elements of a thing. For to understand, intelligere, means to read what is inside a thing, intus legere. Sense and imagination know only external accidents, but the intellect alone penetrates to the interior and to the essence of a thing," end quote. But where nature and art have been collapsed into one another, where there is neither interior essence nor depth of existence, there is nothing to read or penetrate. Intellect, in the traditional sense, becomes obsolete and unintelligible, which I would suggest to you is the condition of possibility for imagining something like artificial intelligence. A disincentive to understanding, in fact, an inducement to thoughtlessness, is therefore built into the heart of our most authoritative form of reason and enforced by a system of education that consists in rigorously not asking the great existential questions that once moved the West to philosophize about the meaning of our humanity. Modern education, says Eric Vogelin, is, quote, "the art of adjusting people so solidly to the climate of opinion prevalent at the time that they feel no desire to know. Education is the art of preventing people from acquiring knowledge that would enable them to articulate the questions of existence. Education is the art of pressuring young people into a state of alienation that will result in either quiet despair or aggressive militancy, end quote. Vogelin wrote this in 1973. We don't have to look very far to the events of recent months even to see that this is another one of those statements that grows truer with time. There have been political and intellectual protests against this technological view of reality and the new Atlantis as our social and political form, almost from the moment they were commenced. There were the Luddites, who attempted to defend their homes and their traditional ways of life against the encroachment of the machine. The Romantic movement was both an intellectual and an aesthetic protest against the mechanistic view of reality, though it lacked the strength to resist being absorbed into it where it mattered most in the life sciences. Even John Dewey, the godfather of American progressivism, who sought to bring every facet of human life under the purview of technocratic governance, lamented that a gray, mechanical, meaningless universe drained of spiritual and aesthetic value was the price to be paid for interminable technological progress. He sought to offset that meaninglessness and reinvigorate the spirit by imagining democracy as a mystical communion in which everyone plays a part in realizing the boundless possibilities exemplified by science. If you ever wondered how our democracy became an object of religious devotion among progressives, look no further than Dewey. The quiet despair and aggressive militancy that we see with alarming frequency everywhere is what happens when people who have believed in nothing but science and politics have discovered that their God has failed them. Where do you turn? There's been a renewed protest of late against this technocratic, disenchanted world. I'm thinking particularly of Rod Dreher's Living in Wonder and Paul Kingsnorth's Against the Machine, which I recently reviewed in First Things and which I understand a number of you here are going to be discussing in a group soon. What I described as the milieu in which we live and move our having and have our being, the total system under which we live, Kingsnorth calls the machine. And I highly recommend his book. The connection he draws between the different parts of the machine is quite astonishing, actually. In a world that so often seems like it's falling apart, I think Kingsnorth really shows how it all hangs together. And you'll come away from reading it seeing the world and seeing our era in a different way. Kingsnorth recognizes that the machine is what I have called a regime of necessity. There is no outside it. The only way out is through. That we might somehow come through with our humanity intact, he counsels acts of ascesis, acts of sacrificial self-denial that create, quote, shatter zones, lessening the machine's grip upon our lives. He argues that we need to recover myth and song and poetry, to break the stranglehold of technocratic reason on our minds, and to see those aspects of reality to which we have been blinded. We cannot free ourselves from the machine by escaping it, but only by transcending it. All of this is great as far as it goes. The problem is that it doesn't go far enough. There is a tendency among these re-enchantment projects to juxtapose the poetic and the rational, to acquiesce, in other words, to the modern reduction of reason to scientific and technical reason. Re-enchantment then comes to look a lot like sprinkling some kind of spiritual fairy dust over the top of Dewey's cold, gray, mechanical world, or discovering the paranormal between the machinations of its gears. The more poetry, less reason position ends up ensuring that the poet can only ever be a mere poet, not a realist of distances, as Flannery O'Connor describes the prophetic vocation of the writer, or a realist of depths. It is a permanent concession to the conceit that the rationality of the poet is subordinate to that of the scientist. Whereas we ought to say that the astrophysicist with whom I once shared a stage, who told the audience that a star is really just a factory for making chemicals, is really more like a bad poet, especially when compared with the Platonic and Christian understanding of the sun as a visible image of the invisible God, whose blinding light is invisible in itself and yet illuminates and sustains everything it touches. That's poetry. It's also true. I'd like to reflect for just a moment on an example from American literature that I think illustrates the sort of distances that I'm talking about and the depths of being and truth that are invisible to our technocratic rationality, but that remain a constitutive dimension of our world. The example is from Our Town, the 1938 play by Thornton Wilder, which I find devastatingly beautiful no matter how many times I read or see it. And the fact that this play, nearly a century on, continues to get such a run year after year gives me hope that human nature is indestructible in spite of all the violence we inflict upon it. I presume many of you are familiar with it. The play gives us an inside view of a slice of early 20th century history in an ordinary New England town. Our town could be, and is indeed meant to be, any town. I grew up, and someday will be buried, in a small town that was a lot like this, though you can probably guess that I'm not from New England, which is probably one reason why the play really resonates with me. And, let's see if I can get through this without cracking up. These notions of an inside view and a slice of history are crucial to the meaning of the play, because one of the important contrasts that the play sets up, and the same juxtaposition appears in a very different way in Wilder's great novel, The Bridge of St. Louis Rey, is the contrast between what we might call a horizontal, empirical, external knowledge of superficial facts, the sort of knowledge belonging to the technocratic paradigm, and a vertical interior knowledge of depths. The outside empiricist view is exemplified by the experts whom the stage manager trots out at the beginning of Act 1 to educate the audience about the town of Grover's Corners. These include a professor from a nearby college who gives a geological history of the area and its migration patterns since the Neolithic era, and the editor of a small-town newspaper who gives a census-like demographic summary of the place. The inside view, where we begin to apprehend the depths and distances, is symbolized by an odd letter to one Jane Crofut and recounted by young Rebecca Gibbs, sister to George, one of the play's main protagonists. The letter was addressed, quote, Jane Crofut, the Crofut Farm, Grover's Corners, Sutton County, New Hampshire, the United States of America, continent of North America, Western Hemisphere, the universe, solar system, the mind of God. The address represents the breadth and depth of the actual world. The outside view is an abstraction from this fullness. From the horizontal empiricist point of view represented by the journalist and the professor, each of these slices of time looks pretty much like any other. Grover's Corners and its citizens look like the families living in ancient Babylon, buying and selling, getting married, having children, and dying, destined to be unremembered by history, except perhaps as data, as some sort of sociological or statistical fact. This is one of the ways that our town really is any town. But from the vertical point of view, from the transcendent vantage point that sees within as well as without, each of these otherwise anonymous statistical data points is a life dense and dramatic and intensively infinite. saturated with meaning too weighty and beautiful for us mortals to bear. We get a glimpse from this point of view in the play's final act, the famous graveyard scene. There we encounter young Emily Webb, whose life we have watched as she matured from a girl to a woman. We have seen her as an adolescent pleading with her mother to reassure her that she was pretty. We have watched as she and George Webb, the boy next door, flirted awkwardly with each other from their bedroom windows. We have glimpsed their high school courtship right up to the eve of their wedding. And now George lying prostrate in the rain before Emily's gravestone. We learn that young Emily has died in childbirth. And we find Emily on the other side of the veil, longing wistfully to relive just one day of her old life with the benefit of the understanding she has already begun to acquire in death. Her deceased neighbors and her mother-in-law plead with her not to return. She doesn't really understand as well as she thinks she does, but she will not be dissuaded. So they prevail upon her at the very least not to return for her wedding day or the birth of her child, but for an unimportant day. Choose the least important day, Mother Gibbs tells her. It will be important enough. Emily chooses her 12th birthday. She returns only to discover that the living cannot see what she sees, that we apparently do not see much at all. She pleads silently with her mother to look at her, to really look at her, as she once pleaded with her to tell her that she was pretty and to understand what the question really meant. But her mother's busy, getting the kids ready for school, oblivious. In desperation, she declares, I can't go on. It goes so fast. We don't have time to look at one another. She breaks down sobbing and returns to the other side saying, I didn't realize. So all that was going on and I never noticed. Do any human beings ever realize life while they live it? Every minute? No, replies the omnipresent stage manager, whose mysterious presence haunts the play. Then, pausing, he adds, the saints and poets, maybe. They do some. Saints and poets are no doubt essential to recovering the reality, the depths of reality, lost to the technological ontology of modernity, which exponentially compounds the blindness inherent in the human condition. Even so, I do not think that more poetry, less reason, is enough to prevent the systematic annihilation, indeed the willing surrender, of everything that once made us human. The power to apprehend the eternal, to peer into the depths of things, to wonder at the meaning of it all, and to transcend our imprisonment to the present moment or the latest thing thereby. Poetic rationality, mythos, may be the highest form of reason in the end for apprehending the reality that exceeds our capacity to express it. Plato seems to have thought so, at least sometimes. It may even be the beginning of the recovery of lost wisdom. Beauty has a way of wounding us and creating an opening for itself through which truth can enter. But it is not enough by itself. Mythos requires logos for its completion. They are inseparable in the end. And we cannot recover a genuinely poetic rationality or recognize the poetic as rational without rescuing truth from its reduction to the factual and the functional. Which means we cannot recover poetic rationality without recovering a truly philosophical rationality that challenges the truth of the machine world and that can give rigorous rational expression to the actual world in its fullness. a world that includes the sort of substantial, self-transcending wholes with interior horizons and a stake in their own being that we ourselves are, a world where people marry and fall in love and enter into the very depths of things. If your theory can't explain that, or explains it by explaining it away, then if it can't explain life, then you need a better theory. We cannot hope to restore the world to its fullness without coming to terms with the inescapable meaning through which we necessarily apprehend it, without acknowledging the existential significance of that incorrigible tendency toward goodness that persists in spite of ourselves, and that is inherent in the intelligibility of all things whatsoever. We cannot rescue reason from its technological reduction without rediscovering what Plato and Aristotle called the unhypothetical first principle, what everybody implicitly understands who understands anything at all. Goodness, truth, and beauty, if they were ever real, have not disappeared from the structure of the universe. Indeed, they do not cease to be nearer to us than we are to ourselves just because we've renounced our ability or our desire to see them. And if they are real and actual, then it must be possible to see them once again. Thank you. Shall I just take my own questions, or are you traveling with a microphone or something? That knock the sign over, excuse me. That'll look good on. I can tell Jared's a teacher because he's comfortable with long, awkward silences that compel people to speak.
Do you see any hopeful signs of the mythos emerging?
I see, it's really difficult to, and this is the difficulty with the re-enchantment projects, right? The difficulty of recovering your sight after you've gouged your eyes out, to use a Flannery O'Connor type image. We can't just will ourselves, right, to see the sun as a visible image of the intelligible good. We might, in fact, will ourselves to believe that, as a matter of faith or what have you. But living when we do, we inevitably carve out whatever belief we can muster from that against the background knowledge that's ever with us that the sun is just a big ball of gas. What I do see, and what I think is hopeful, is that we may have to experience the George Grant, who I cited earlier, has this wonderful phrase, intimations of deprival, right? Which I think is his way of describing something like ancient eros, the longing for that which we lack, but we couldn't long for it at all if we had no knowledge of it, or some, it's the kind of Platonic paradox. The hope I see is in the desire that people, the restlessness and unease itself that people have about the world we've created for ourselves and are subjecting ourselves to, and the longing that you see expressed in all kinds of different ways, both healthy and unhealthy, for something more, right? The return to tradition, for example, among young people, is, I think, and the desire for tradition forsaken by their parents and grandparents, the recognition that they've been given a mess of pottage, is, I think, hopeful, but it might be a hope that expresses itself in an intimation of deprival, right? The work of, and I also think that, my concluding point, that as powerful as what I'm calling the poetic is, and as powerful as beauty is in sort of opening our eyes to things, we really need a renewal of thought, and that's a long, hard, laborious work. And it's a long, hard, laborious work regardless. It's a particularly long, hard, and laborious work in a society dominated by a form of reason that excludes this kind of thinking. And increasingly, that is where we're willing to offload what thinking we have left to the machines that will do it on our behalf. Right? I mean, this is the worrisome thing to me about AI is not simply its external effects in rendering people obsolete or eliminating all different manner of jobs. That's in some ways been happening in manufacturing for a long time. Now we're discovering that actually much of our so-called intellectual work is really machine work too, and we have machines that can do it better than we can. What worries me more is, what happens, what happens when those human functions that are left to us, basic reasoning, basic remembering, right? The basic articulation of subject and predicate, we hand over. What's left for us? And what kind of, how did Vogelin describe it? Alienation or militancy will be left to us under those conditions. So I'm going round and round and round here. I do see signs of hope, but it's hope is not optimism. And I think that the hope is grounded in the fact that I really think that reality is like this, that truth and goodness and beauty are real, that human nature is real, that they're irrepressible, that they keep finding ways to express themselves regardless of what we do. If that's not true, then we have no hope, because it means the world isn't creation. But because it is true, we're resilient, but we're going to need to be resilient. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I think that's the future, that there has to be a method by which you can actually interact with these things. There needs to be a basic knowledge of technique.
Yeah, well, I at least half agree with you, because in the sense that this is coming, whether we want it or not. And so the interacting with it is going to be a necessity, because we're going to find it interposing itself ever more deeply into ordinary functions of our lives. I mean, so those are questions that we have to think about. There's a fundamental problem, I think. I mean, in one sense, I can't answer your question because I'm not a technologist and I don't understand either the technology or the mathematics of it. But there's a problem, I think, that, and I'll also say this, I don't mean to simply say, I don't mean to lapse into the position that I was attempting to critique, what I called the Boromir paradigm, where it's simply a matter of denunciation that this is good or this is bad. I think the first step is to understand what this is, and to understand what this is not on its own terms, right, in terms of how it's constructed or what it can do, but on human terms. And there is a fundamental problem that we encounter over and over and over again, I think, in attempting to think about technology. And that is that we think about technology within the forms of reason generated by technology, which means you never transcend it and get outside it to be able to really understand what it is in a philosophical sense or how it affects us in a philosophical sense. That, I think, if we are to live with this, and we have no choice but to live with this, I can't tell you the quantity of technical knowledge one needs to possess in order to be able to do that, but I suspect whatever quantity it is will be less important than the philosophical formation that we ought to undergo to be able to think humanly about these things. And that's not simply a matter of moral condemnation. That's a matter of, it might help if we understood, for example, human thought better, so that we didn't imagine that human thought was simply a matter of data transfer or computation. If we reflected on what it means to understand something, as opposed to a form of intelligence or what we regard as intelligence that doesn't really involve understanding. Perhaps if we could heighten, had a deeper sense of that contrast, we'd have a better sense of the limitations of this and how we might live with it without, sacrificing ourselves to it.
You mentioned a couple of times human thought, especially in regards to AI, and I think.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that last part. I don't know why I'm putting my ear to the microphone.
So you mentioned a couple of times human thought, especially regarding AI, which I noted, and I was wondering, if you thought there are any ethical uses of AI, especially with your students, because I kind of identified the same thing that. Well, maybe not the same thing, but for me personally, as long as you're not using AI to replicate thought or do thinking for you, then it's an ethical use. But I know it's a really hot topic and everyone has different perspectives.
Yeah, I don't typically think of these things principally along the axis of ethical or unethical. Like, this is licit and good, this is illicit and bad, which I think we have to do that because there are going to be those places where we're forced to make that kind of a decision. But let me put a different question back to you. Let's imagine for a moment that there are perfectly licit and moral uses of AI. Take that question off the table and just grant it. Maybe one way to think about this would be to ask, what do the moral and licit uses of AI, what effects do those have on the user? In other words, how is the user formed or shaped? How are your thought patterns structured? How are your expectations? Your willingness or your ability to abide with difficult things over a long period of time, for example, altered by your recourse to these good and moral uses of AI. How are, one book that and it's not about AI per se, but one of the best books out there right now, I mentioned it at the very start of the lecture, is this book by Anton Barbacai called A Web of Our Own Making, The Nature of Digital Formation. And he's the one who has that wonderful phrase, what happened to us how we were changed while we weren't looking. And he raises all sorts of interesting questions about how our entire structure of expectation is changed, for example, by living in a world, in a frictionless world. Right? In a world where, I'm out of coffee, swoop, it'll be here tomorrow. Or later today, if you live in a civilized place, I guess. That doesn't happen in Washington. We're lucky if it makes it. These things shape us, and they shape us in ways that are both profound, but also really subtle and therefore largely invisible to us. And especially they shape us if we have no experience of a world outside of this. Right? I can remember it taking time to get cash, like going to banks and talking to people and getting money. It took half a morning, right? And now I find cash so cumbersome. Like I've got like $40 in my pocket that I don't even remember is there, that I've been carrying around forever because I never use money. And in the airport, you can walk into a store. I mean, imagine when your biometric data is just uploaded. The moment you walk in to a store and you can take something off the shelf and just walk out and it registers and you're billed. This is already happening. How are we shaped by that? Right? How do we see the world as a result of living that way? What are our habits? What are our virtues? What are our vices? What are our capacities? I mean, everybody knows, right, that it's pretty well known now that we seem to be moving into a post-literate generation because it's harder and harder and harder to read a book. And it's harder and harder and harder to read a book because it's harder and harder and harder to train our attention on any one thing over a sustained period of time. What does that do to your ability? Okay, so the ability to attend to something undividedly is the basis of a lot of stuff. It's the basis of your ability to really reason something out, to develop an argument from beginning to end. It's the basis of your ability to articulate yourself eloquently and powerfully. It's the basis of your ability to pray. Right? If you can't train your mind on anything for more than a few seconds without it being constantly distracted, it's the basis of your ability to have an interior life, an introspective life. And we're giving a lot of that up. And that's not just AI, right? That's digital formation. This gentleman's question, and Jared and I were discussing this over dinner. I can't keep up with all the things that AI is supposed to be able to do. I don't know what all of its capabilities are going to be. And so it's hard for me to answer the question, well, if I do this, is it okay? But the general question of how is this going to shape me? If the soul is in a way all things, what's my soul going to be like by being united with this thing? Or by handing off its most characteristic functions to something else. And, maybe what was behind your question was the difference between generative AI, asking AI to write your paper for you for class tomorrow, or using it for research purposes. I mean, this is a distinction that every school is trying to come to terms with to figure out what is cheating and what's not. But the question I would ask, and the question we're wrestling with, is setting the question of cheating aside. What is education? Right? It used to mean developing your mind in a certain way, having your mind conformed to the truth of reality, which is a long and arduous process. It involves undergoing something. It involves being changed. And now we think we can replace that or short circuit it by having AI do it more efficiently. Just the process of learning to go through a book and read it and digest it and understand it, where when AI can present you with the same quote unquote information much more efficiently and easily, arguably deprives you of something. And as a result of being deprived, you'll be different. And one of the questions we ought to be asking ourselves is, well, do we want to be different in the ways that this is likely to change us? I don't think it makes us more human, right? It certainly doesn't make us more human in terms of the things that the things that always defined our humanity, right? As rational animals. That's a long answer. There's only a couple of questions. There were some others. This young woman over here had. I know Matthew Crawford. Yeah, he's good. Yeah.
Well, so he suggests that
I think Crawford is right. No, absolutely. And I would extend, I mean, craftsmanship is great. And if you think about even the phrase craftsmanship, right? To become a craftsman is not simply to produce something outside of yourself, it is to become something. You undergo a change in acquiring the art, right? And it's a change, and it's a change that requires you to focus your attention, to make sacrifices, to undergo something, to undergo a kind of rigor. It's difficult. And these are, so it involves a certain kind of patience, involves a certain kind of abiding with things, as well as involves a certain kind of mastery of something, particular with respect to whatever particular art you are a craftsman of. I think that is, not only is craftsmanship, I think an important antidote, and one of the kinds of things that Kingsnorth means by creating shatter zones. I think it's also a very traditional analogy for a process of human formation that you can undergo in other ways besides just being a craftsman, right? I mean, being a student can be, very much like that. Learning a language can be very much like that. Becoming, mastering an instrument can be very much like that. And these things put you in touch with reality at a human pace. They involve your mind and your body, your whole person. These are ways of remaining in the world. What's the phrase now? Touching grass. I don't like it because I don't like memes in general. I think that would qualify as one. But this idea that we're made to live in time and space. We're made to inhabit our bodies. And the obliteration of those conditions is not a more human way of living. So, I think Crawford is very wise on this. So I assume you're referring principally to shop class's Soulcraft? Either one. Yeah. Another great book recommendation. Thank you.
I think this will be the last question.
Is the rejection of the Boromir paradigm, which is technology is a tool and it should be used for good purposes by good people, is the rejection of that, does that necessitate accepting, we'll call it the Frodo paradigm, which is, we should...
Throw it in Mount Doom?
Yeah, throw it in Mount Doom. This will lead to our destruction. And, if we live in a world where that's impossible, is there a third option?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't simply reject the Boromir paradigm, right? There's a truth in it, right? I mean, we are confronted with things whose nature and meaning is unclear, things that we have to confront with necessity, the smartphone being one of them, right? I mean, they do, in a way, constitute a regime of necessity. There are some jobs that you cannot do, right? Increasingly, more and more of them. Certainly jobs that involve your being in the public where you are required to present yourself via social media. Not to do that is to be invisible and a non-participant in the world. Now, you can decide it's not worth the price, and I'm not going to do that, and therefore this will not be my work. But that's a big decision and a costly. I mean, not everybody can live in that kind of heroic way. I mean, it's going to be increasingly difficult, if not impossible. It may already be to be a physician, right? I mean, if you go to the doctor's office, you're talking to your doctor. Your doctor's looking at the screen. And this is not, I think, in most practices, optional. Right? So if you're going to practice medicine in a hospital like the Mayo Clinic, you're going to have to conform the way you do medicine to what technology makes available. Right? And this is going to be true whether we're talking about using computers for consultations or whether we're talking about certain, the use of robots for certain surgical techniques. I mean, it's remarkable. I'm told that you can now perform surgery on an aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf from here by, robotic means. There's a really interesting, I think there are really interesting questions. The robots perform the surgery. You control the robot from a distance. That may not be necessary that much longer. I don't know. And if I'm wrong about some technical detail here, forgive me, but this is just my understanding. But this is part of what I think Jonas is trying to illustrate about being ensnared, as it were, or technology as a regime of necessity, that we don't really have choices about, what part of what it means to say that technology is a regime of necessity is that we are compelled to conform our activity to what the conditions that technology sets increasingly. So, to that extent, my problem with the Boromir paradigm is not that it's simply false. We have to make those ethical choices, but that it just doesn't, it's only partially true. There might be technologies that need to be thrown into the volcano of Mount Doom. We can decide about those. I'm not going to name names, but we could guess at a few. But on the whole, to say that this is a regime of necessity is to say that it's too big for us to do that. So what is the third option? I go back to King's North. The only way out is through. And the only way through is to be able to see within and beyond and above the regime. And so it's not, I'm not just being pious when I say that a renewal of thought and a renewal of a different kind of thinking and the recovery of a more profound and profoundly philosophical form of reason is the only way to maintain, to live freely in a regime of necessity. I think that's actually a pretty Platonic understanding.